Hi, it's me. I'm back. Um, I haven't been videoing myself since early last year. Or I have been sending some videos, but I got some crazy hairs here. They've been going to a more selective audience. So this is my first time in 2020 putting up a public video. So that's very exciting. My silence, I guess, was overwhelm or something along those lines. My life changed pretty drastically immediately after I started my YouTube channel. Anyway, maybe I'll process that someday. But for today, I am coming to you to talk about anger, which is my word of the year, and how anger and intentional living do or do not go together. So exciting. Um, I've made some quick notes. It's been a while since I did this, so hopefully you don't mind me looking over your shoulder every now and then. So let's start with a quick review of intentional living since it's been a while. For me, intentional living is um, uh, intentional living is when I live according to a set of values that I have chosen, not a set of values that's been handed down to me or placed on me. So, living according to a set of values of my choice. And then an important second piece is checking in with those values whenever I'm doing things, making a decision, um, you know, deciding what to do with my day or my life or setting goals, anything along those lines, and really just checking in with my values pretty constantly, at the very least on a daily basis. And I do that because it brings me the feelings that I desire. So it's interesting when you think about like decision making and feelings, because sometimes feelings show up in the heat of the moment and you're not expecting them. And then, so how does that work with intentional living? This kind of like, we view intentional living as like this commitment and this time you're putting in. So what happens when like in the heat of the moment, you have a feeling that bubbles up? Um, so how do you make sure, oh, did I do that according to my values? I mean, I think the short answer is that for me, I don't always act according to my values. Um, and then, I go through the process of forgiveness and, um, you know, sort of working that experience into my psyche going forward. But another way, I think heat of the moment feelings, when I do act according to my values, even though I haven't had time to like sit and think, I think it's because over time, you know, I, this is a practice, and over time it becomes easier. So I've been doing this for 5 years or so. My values have shifted a little bit, but not like so great of a shift that I'm not comfortable with them and I don't know what they are or exploring them or whatever. Um, So over time, they become instilled. And then when something in the moment comes up, I don't always necessarily have to be like, okay, what, blah, 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 let's go through this process. And the reason I bring that up is because anger, as you know, is often seen as and talked about as a hot emotion or a hot feeling, whereas like it can show up and take us by surprise. One minute we're, everything's fine and we're watching TV or eating dinner with the family, and the next minute we're seeing red and we're throwing plates at a wall. Of course, we know that that's not actually an accurate depiction of anger. I think anyone with a good handle on their emotions knows that anger is much more complicated than that. But that's kind of the rap it gets. So I want to make sure that when I'm exploring how anger works with intentional living, I consider this tendency we have to maybe ignore it to the point that it gets, the way it gets this reputation is that we ignore it, or I ignore it for so long that then it bubbles up at maybe unseemly times. Um, so to keep that from happening, as I've started exploring anger and what it means to me this year, um, the biggest, I guess, lesson, if you will, that I've learned so far this year is just that anger is an emotion, just like any other emotion. It's a feeling. And because it's a feeling, then it can come and go. And in fact, one of the things I've learned, that's been sort of, I've been sort of sitting with, is that feelings in general actually always come and go. They're actually very quick. So there you go. Anger gets a bad rap, but actually all feelings are flashes of feeling. And what we're sitting with, what's hanging around, is more of like our reaction to that feeling, how we feel about it, how we're going to go about processing it, and our actions. Like, what do we then do with that feeling? And we kind of lump all that in with how we're feeling, but those are actually two separate things. The feeling itself might be very quick, and then everything else that comes after, can span anywhere from 5 minutes to, 5 months or years, even in some cases. Um, so it's helpful for me to remember that anger is a feeling, and that because it's a feeling, it does come up quickly, just like any other feeling. It can show up, whenever I feel angry. Um, and then that I have the control over it. I have control over sort of the length of this aftermath, just like I do with any other feeling. So that's one thing. I think the reason feelings seem like um, they take a longer time, or we're more like we're sitting with a feeling, um, they can seem more sort of low grade and long term is the way I think of it. So I think anger can be one of those things, partly because in my own experience, I haven't really been taught the appropriate ways to go through that aftermath, the healthy ways to go through that aftermath. So I tend to push it aside, which doesn't make the feeling go away, right? Or I tend to repress it. I get scared of my own anger. I'm uncomfortable with my own anger. So then that's when the feeling kind of lingers, and I guess, if you will, maybe comes up and goes away and comes up and goes away. If we think of a feeling as this flash kind of thing. Um, so in that way, like a feeling like love that I know what to do with. I know the appropriate ways. If I'm feeling loving, I know the appropriate way to go about expressing that feeling or processing that feeling, or even sadness to a certain extent, because I've spent so much time being sad in my short life. I have learned, coping mechanisms, and I've learned different ways that I process sadness. So I haven't really, I'm just beginning to explore how, both what are the options for a healthy process of, experiencing and expressing anger. And then also, how do I feel anger? How do I express it? How does it show up in my body? What works for me? And that takes like sort of trying out different things. So if I'm just learning what even the options are, then obviously I haven't fully explored, the range of options that are going to work for me. Um, so really, this not knowing what to do with the feeling of anger is really that's what turns it into this low grade, long term, um, unexplored, unprocessed feeling. Um, pause. Gotta go to the next page. So that brings up a lot of questions for me. And actually, this year, along with anger, I think because it's taking me out of my comfort zone, so far out of my comfort zone, that I've been remaining just curious. And when questions come up for me, I just try to assess them the best way I know how. And sometimes that means just writing them down. So I wrote some questions down as I was thinking about anger. How do I reconcile anger with my other fleeting feelings? How do I express anger in a healthy, nonviolent manner? Very important for me as a pacifist, but also as someone who comes from a background of people with, quick tempers. And how do I release my anger so it doesn't become a low grade long term thing? How do I release it so it doesn't fester, but also in releasing it, I don't want to ignore it because I think that's when it comes back. So I think the answers to all of those lies in the idea of anger, the relationship between anger and action. And I would love to explore that in another video because I'm still like brand new into that relationship. I'm reading a lot about it, thinking a lot about it, and I know that there's some juiciness there. I don't feel ready to talk about it because I haven't, I guess I just haven't gotten my ducks in a row or whatever on that topic. For now, I think what's important for me with anger and living intentionally right now is being able to acknowledge it like I would any other feeling. And then if I can acknowledge it like I would any other feeling, then I'm able to kind of hold it up to my set of values. And that allows me to process it and see really, does anger belong in a life in my choice to live intentionally? Is there a place for anger in there? So I thought what would be useful to really make this more personal and less abstract, more concrete, is just to look at some of my values and kind of pair anger with them and see what happens. So I started with, as I was making notes for this video, I started with my top three, the first three values that I found meaning in, and the ones that have been hanging around as others come and go. And also just, my sort of top three are I think of them as like umbrella values, I guess, over other values. And so for me, those three are authenticity, honesty, and positivity. And I think, when I think about does anger play well with authenticity and honesty, I think the answer is a clear yes, because I know the answer is a clear yes, because I think that's actually why I chose anger as my word of the year, because a part of me knew that I wasn't being authentic or honest when anger would show up and I didn't know how to process it. Then I was losing a piece of myself. So I wasn't able to be fully present or fully authentic. And I certainly wasn't being honest because with myself or with others. And I think this idea that, to go off script for 1 minute, I think this idea that anger is like a feeling that masks other feelings. I'm not a psychologist, but to me, that doesn't ring true. I think that anger is actually its own feeling. And I think when we try to say, like, well, let's get behind the anger, let's get under the anger, to me, that is taking away the honesty of the anger. So that has never really sat well with me, though, I tried to believe that because it seemed like, oh yeah, then if it's not really about anger, then I can deal with this other feeling. But in doing that, I was ignoring my anger. So I wasn't being honest with myself, or with those around me. Um, so yeah, so those authenticity, authenticity and honesty to me go with anger. And, that's an easy sell for me, I guess. Um, and, I would love to hear how that sits with you too. The third value, positivity, is a little bit of a bigger challenge, I would say, because of anger has a certain reputation, and then positivity has a certain reputation, and certainly I have certain feelings or views of positivity that do on the surface seem like they would not play well with anger. Anger is typically seen as negative, honestly. So in that way, it's almost as though anger and positivity could not exist in the same space. Now, I don't think that's true, or I wouldn't be. At the very least, I'm curious to know if that's true because I'm exploring it, right? So I'm gonna question that kind of like automatic dichotomy that pops into my head. I think it's useful to when I'm holding anger up to positivity, I needed to remind myself of what I mean by positivity. And actually, this is a value that I still wholeheartedly believe in, but I have been fine tuning, I guess, the way I adhere to positivity. So yeah, so what is positivity to me as a value? I think so for a short and sweet definition, positivity would be choosing to see that see the benefits of any certain situation. And the reason I do that, the reason that's meaningful for me personally, is that my brain, because of the way I'm wired or the way I was raised, or for whatever reason, my brain likes to focus on the negative. That's something I know about myself. But that doesn't bring me the feelings I desire of ease and joy and fun even. So positivity is less like optimism for me than it is just a balancing of my natural propensity to kind of go dark, if you will. So I value positivity, and that means I choose to notice the things that are good. Um, so, how does that stack up? How does that line up against anger? Um, Fascinating question, right? Because then I have to kind of like redefine anger, because if anger is negative and I value positivity, then I would be choosing to kind of look for the good as a way to balance my anger. Um, that doesn't feel right to me. I don't actually think that anger is negative. I don't think that anger and positivity are going to be opposites. Um, in fact, I think if I'm ignoring my anger, then that actually keeps me from being able to see the good. Um, because then what's happening if I'm ignoring or disguising my anger again is that I'm not being honest, I'm not being authentic, and I'm also directing my energy um, in a negative direction. So I'm focusing my energy in a negative direction, like my energy is being spent ignoring something rather than acknowledging something. So actually, for positivity and anger, the way that they go together for me, it seems, is that if I acknowledge my anger, then I'm able to, process it, express it and get back to, I'm not sure if that's the right phrase, but um, be able to integrate, I guess, my anger with the good of any situation. That's rough. That's a rough definition or a rough thought, and that's okay. That's what I have. That's what I have so far. I want to keep thinking about anger and positivity. One correlation I had that I actually feel more comfortable with is my clinical depression. And I feel more comfortable with that versus anger because I acknowledged my clinical depression now, almost 20 years ago. So even though I've had my roller coaster experience, I've certainly spent more time thinking about how my depression can integrate in a life lived intentionally. Um, and so one thing I will say is that I see depression. My depression is more than like a sad feeling. I see it more as a state of being than a feeling. But I think it's useful to still kind of like process that again because I feel more comfortable with depression and see, well, how does that play with positivity? Because again, we label depression as something negative, um, for lack of a better word. So it might be um, similar to anger. It's it seems like it wouldn't fit with the value of positivity. Another thing about depression that's different is that I don't have a choice. So I can't just like up and decide like, well, I'm just not going to be a person who lives with clinical depression. That choice was not given to me. I can decide what to do with it. But so I think that's a fascinating difference too, something maybe to think about more. So how does depression play with positivity? Um, I find it's actually very similar to what I was saying about anger, is that I find if I'm pushing depression away, I'm pretending like it's not there, um, I'm ignoring it, disguising it, sleeping through it, all of the ways in which I can distance myself from it, then that's when I'm actually not able to see good. But when I fully embrace, for lack of a better word, I guess, my depression, then when my depression is integrated, right, it's a part of my whole self, and I'm honoring it, um, then I have balance. I can see good, I can see negative, I can sort of determine how I feel about things objectively. Um, so again, like, I don't think depression and positivity are opposites. I don't think they are in conflict. I think again, it's like, what am I doing with the depression or not doing with it that is affecting my ability to live out that value of positivity? So again, depression, state of being; anger, fleeting emotion. Those are two very different things, but I think the model is useful, and it was the closest model I could come up with. Not a perfect match, but there are some similarities there that I think help me explore anger and positivity. So I think I would check that box off. I would say that anger, the healthy expression of anger, does allow me to live out my value of positivity. Um, if you're exploring anger and curious about it, I would love for you to choose some values, choose a couple, or just choose one if that feels, safer, and see how it plays out. Kind of work through it in your head and see um, if for you anger and this value coexist. Um, and yeah, let me know. I'd love to think about it too. There's nothing I like more than sitting around and thinking about values. Um, so depression, not the perfect model, but it works. Another to go off of this model idea is that when I'm exploring a concept that I'm not familiar with, like anger and what it means to be an angry woman, I look around. Who is doing this successfully? In my opinion, who is living their anger most authentically, and it's a tough time to find that person, and it's a really tough feeling to identify in other women, for so many reasons. But I did come up with someone, and her name is Elizabeth Warren. And um, maybe I'm projecting, but I feel like Elizabeth Warren acknowledges and expresses her anger, that she has no problem doing that, but she isn't seen as like an angry person. Um, I mean, by those who love her and know her and respect her, I think you wouldn't say like, well, what's Elizabeth Warren like? And they say, well, she's angry, They say like, she's smart, intelligent, she's a hard worker, she's happy. Having read her books, like she has so much hope and faith and confidence in our country. To me, that isn't like this is an angry person. But she is able to express anger. If you watch any of the debates, I think you could agree with me on that. So that's kind of a useful model for me to look at a woman who is presumably living her ideal life, making hard decisions, and expressing anger. Um, and moving through it. So that's take that take that for what you will. But it's useful to me to have you know, someone to look at and admire, look up to, I guess. Um, so back to the original question: how can anger as a feeling live harmoniously with the rest of my values? And I think a better question, not better question, but a more detailed question, a more introspective question would be, how can the expression of anger, the healthy expression of anger, be a part of my intentional living practices? That's what I want to know. I guess that's why I chose it for my word of the year. So that's my original question. So, in thinking about my values, in thinking about my experience with clinical depression, in thinking about feelings in general, and in looking at Elizabeth Warren, here are sort of here's the process. Is that a good word for it? That I came up with? I don't know. The jury's out on the word process, but anyway, here are the steps that I came up with. To to allow anger to be a part of my intentional living practices. So the first is to acknowledge anger without shame or secrecy. Um, and that's because it's normal to feel anger. So I also think of this step, I'm thinking of it as a way of honoring that feeling, right? Um, Next, decide what I'm going to do with the feeling. How long am I going to sit with it? Um, how much time does it require for me to fully feel it, or kind of remember that aftermath of the feeling? I have control over how long each of those steps takes. So that's, for me, that's the intentional part, like the deciding, right? What am I going to do with this feeling? And then next would come processing it, processing the anger, moving through it, um, doing the work, I guess. Um, and then the fourth one is integrating the anger into my experiences, into my psyche, into my body, who I am. Um, oh, I'm sorry. Let me step back to 3. So 3 is the processing. So we've acknowledged, we've decided what we're going to do with it, and then we actually do the work. That's the processing. I just wanted to touch on some ways I might process anger. Guess what? They're the same ways I would process any feeling. I might share my anger with a close friend, talk it out. I might do some writing about it. I will always do a lot of thinking because that's my preferred way of processing. I might yell or scream, just like if I'm excited and happy. I might, you know, um, I might go to extremes, right? And that might happen with anger too. That's there's a lot to explore there. But I think even the question of how do I process anger, and the acknowledgement that I process all of my feelings in different ways, that's a juicy nugget right there to take away. So I'm going to hang on to that one. Um, then I move on to 4, which is integration. Integrating is a word that has been coming up a lot for me. So it seemed to fit this well. The idea that after I have processed the anger, it doesn't just dissipate, or I'm not over it, but it has now become a part of who I am. That experience has become a part of who I am. And the importance of step 4 is that I'm going to feel angry again at some point, maybe 2 minutes later, or maybe a week is going to go by. And so by integrating this experience every time I'm feeling anger, acknowledging it, processing it, then it becomes easier. Right now, this is like, I've got my steps. Like, this is arduous in some ways. At the very least, I have to be very conscious about my anger because it's new to me. I'm learning, I'm practicing, I'm adopting new ways of being. But over time, as step 4, the importance of step 4 is that over time, as I'm integrating each experience of anger, then this is going to become easier, I presume. It's going to be a long time, I think, knowing myself. I'm pretty stubborn. You probably know that. And that translates to kind of getting stuck, I think, sometimes in certain habits. So I think, it's going to be more than just a year of sitting with my anger to really be able to go through those 4 steps over and over and over, to do them consciously and intentionally, so that anger can be a part of my living intentionally. So yeah, it leaves me with a process that I can follow, which I like. That's the intentional piece aspect that I'm drawn to. And it also leaves me with a lot more questions. So more videos in the future. A few questions that came up as I was writing about this issue is the difference between short-term anger and long-term anger. So as I become more accustomed to anger as a feeling, I think it would be interesting to explore, I guess short-term anger would be like going through those 4 steps quickly or something. I don't even know. That's why it's a question, right? And another question that I'm almost not acknowledging, I'll just acknowledge it here, is the difference between anger and rage. And this, it has come up a lot in my reading and in talking to women. For some reason, I've stayed away from it. So we'll see what we can do with that. Maybe a video about that would give me permission to get closer to that issue. And then what are healthy expressions of anger? So I listed some ways to process feelings: sharing, writing, thinking, yelling. There's a lot more. Shopping is a way to process feelings for me. Um, it would be interesting, I think, to really just do a deep dive into really specific ways that I could express anger um, healthily. Is that a word? That I can express my anger, particularly as a mom, someone who's raising children who identify as male at the current moment. Yeah, you probably know where I'm getting with that, but just children in general live with their emotions right here. And so, if anger is one of their emotions too, and it is, then how could my healthy expression of anger sort of translate into the experiences that they're soaking up and they're integrating and becoming a part of them? So, anyway, I think coming up with specific options for expressing anger would be very helpful to me, and I'd like to explore that on a video. So, um, leave me a comment and let me know which of those three questions you would most like to see me explore. The difference between short-term and long-term anger, the difference between anger and rage, or specific ways to process anger in that are healthy and conducive to my conscious motherhood. Okay, kind of a low-key gray day, but I hope there's some good takeaways in here for you, and I can't wait to see what you have to say about anger and feelings and values and all of it. Thanks for watching.